Those of you living in Texas didn't realize it, but you are living in the wind capital of the United States, and it's not even close. And people are shocked when they find that out. For example, I have a family member who lived in New Mexico, and he said, "Oh, yeah, we've got to be one of the nation's wind leaders." Ha! Yeah, they're right up there with New York. This, unfortunately, the entity that built this report merged with another entity, and they don't produce a slide or a chart that's this clean, although I'll be able to show you information later. So this is 2019 data, and the picture is changing, but it's changing in a way that is very predictable. If you take Texas, who is number one in wind power, add Iowa, who was number two in wind power, Oklahoma, who is number three in wind power, and Kansas, who's number four in wind power, add up those three states, numbers two, three, and four, and they still do not equal the wind power in Texas. If you add in number five in the country, California, then it becomes greater than Texas. But Texas is by far the wind capital of the world. Incidentally, if you're wondering why California is so much, it's like, wait a minute, they didn't seem to have very good wind resources. If you look at here on these are the more liberal local governments. They're going to favor the wind installation. And if you've ever driven through Palm Springs or through the Mojave Desert out near Edwards Air Force Base, you look at an area where they really took a very predictable wind resource of coming through the mountains, and they harnessed that with a lot of great wind turbines. So how did the picture change in 2019? Well, look where the most construction was, the number one wind state in the nation. Texas had by far the most wind construction. Number two by far was Iowa, which is the number two. And then everybody else was relatively modest. Although you see this 475, 141, not insignificant. Notice California and Oregon, very small because the reality is they don't have great wind resources. And then I found this really cool chart that sums it up. This is in 2020. Who added the most wind? The yellow is solar, really smart color schemes on this chart. The green is battery storage. We'll talk about battery storage later in the course, but you can see only California and Texas were doing anything appreciable in battery storage. But you can see that Texas by far, in 2020 added the most clean energy resources in terms of wind and solar. Iowa, you can again see, was number two with wind additions. Oklahoma, Wyoming. Illinois invested quite a bit. Missouri didn't have any, and so they made a nice step out. But again, if you look in these, you see the usual suspects. Where are the utility scale solars being built? Texas, California, Florida, and then Georgia and Virginia. And this makes sense to me in that they don't have great wind resources. So if they're going to go for clean power, it's going to be for solar, even though they're not a great resource for solar either. Arizona, this is kind of amazing to me that they don't do more solar power, and it's probably just driven by the utilities needs. Incidentally, I know that Arizona, because I lived there, one of my former assignments, they have a huge nuclear power plant that generates a lot of their electricity, so they may just not feel the need to reduce their carbon as much. So this chart, and again, this is from a very clean power activity report. It is from a renewable energy advocate, so I think we can trust their numbers. They say wind and solar provided 10.7% of the nation's electricity. In Texas, you can see it was 17.1%, and we are the clean power capital of the world, because even though California has the lead in utility and residential solar, our lead in wind far eclipses that. But look up at Iowa. They get 57% of their electricity from wind and solar. And that's in part because they have very steady wind resources, and so they can rely on it a little bit more than some other places can. Kansas, 43%. And you go like, well, why isn't Texas higher? Even Oklahoma, 35%. New Mexico, 25%. If Texas is the clean energy capital of the United States, why does it only get 17.1% of its electricity from these resources? And that is a key part to the answer to this question. Why Texas? Why is Texas the clean power capital of the United States. There are a couple of very important reasons why. The first is that we do have good resources. We know that especially out in the Panhandle in this area, there's really good wind, and there's a lot of open space where, quite frankly, the farmers and ranchers are going to be very happy to receive the lease payments from the wind operations and increasingly the solar operations. So it's a very good resource area for the renewable energies. But gee, Iowa, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, they're even better resources. Why don't they build more there? Because Texas not only has good resources, it has a big need in the terms of all these population centers in central Texas. And so, unlike most of the other places where there's a lot of wind, the customer and the wind generation capability are relatively close together, because what has to connect them? Electrical generate or transmission lines, and those aren't popular. They're not cheap. People don't like to have them built, and so being close to where the power is generated is very critical. Plus, believe it or not, even in oil and gas oriented conservative Texas back in the 20-aughts, which is say 2000 to 2010, when Rick Perry was the governor, Texas spent $5 billion to build a lot of transmission lines that were really oriented towards taking the electricity out of the Panhandle in West Texas and moving it into the population centers in Texas where the electricity could be consumed. So why Texas? Good resources and a good market. And the good market is both the consumers and the grid infrastructure to move the electricity to those consumers. And that's why you see some of these projects happening in Texas. Finally, let's talk about the wind production tax credit. In solar, it's an investment tax credit. In other words, you get to claim it as soon as you complete construction. Or I don't know all the IRS rules, don't hold me to that, but it's based on your construction costs. Wind, on the other hand, is a production tax credit. In other words, you get the tax credit for when you produce things. So up to or through 2017, it was 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. And that may not strike you as very much money, but in a lot of cases, the generators are only being paid 2, 3, 4 cents to generate the electricity. So it's like a doubling of the profit margin for a generator. But you could collect 2.3 cents for 10 years. It has been reduced. Again, it's just like the investment tax credit, depending on which party controls the White House and which party controls Congress. There's always negotiations about this. It has been extended now through 2021, and I can almost guarantee you it is going to be extended again in the infrastructure talks this fall. Right now, it's 18 cents per kilowatt hour. Very importantly, the offshore wind also has an investment tax credit. And that's the good news is you get to write your stuff off right up front of 30% through 2026. And so this is trying to jumpstart the offshore wind industry to make it more competitive. And so now one of the questions is, what is the Biden administration in negotiations with Congress going to do? But I will predict whatever happens, they will be extended, and they'll try to increase them. I don't think you'll see numbers above these. But I could certainly see this number being kicked out another 10 years or so, and this number kicked out for much longer. So we'll dive into offshore in the next video.